She pressed her thin coat tighter around her waist, her infant sips, tears freezing on his cheeks, while hurried passers-by stepped around them without a second glance, until a sleek black car pulled up, and a concerned hand offered warmth beyond imagination. The wind cut through Lauren Thompson's threadbare coat like a shard of glass. It clawed at the thin blanket wrapped around her infant son Leo, whose tiny shuddering breaths were visible as puffs of white in the biting Toronto air. She shifted her weight from one numb foot to the other, her worn boots offering no protection from the frozen concrete beneath. People flowed past her, a river of dark coats and averted eyes, their faces pinched against the cold and their own private urgencies. A man in a tailored suit gave her a wide berth, his polished shoes crunching on the salt-strewn sidewalk without breaking stride. He never once looked at her face. Lauren pulled Leo closer, trying to shield him with the scant warmth of her own body. His cries had subsided into weak, hitching whimpers, a sound that terrified her more than any scream. His small chapped lips were tinged with blue, and his eyelids fluttered, heavy with a cold-induced lethargy. A woman dragging a rolling suitcase glanced at them, a flicker of something, pity, maybe annoyance, crossing her features before she hurried on, disappearing into the entrance of a brightly lit office building. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, sealing away the warmth. "Please, someone, just look at us, just see us." Before we continue with the story, be sure to let us know where you're watching from and what time it is in the comments. We love learning about our viewers. Now let's get back to the story. A group of teenagers, laughing and pushing each other, stumbled by. One of them, a boy with a red beanie, nearly collided with her. He mumbled a quick, "Sorry," his eyes darting from her face to the bundle in her arms and then quickly away, a flush of discomfort rising on his cheeks. His friends pulled him along, their laughter dying as they passed, replaced by awkward, whispered comments that the wind snatched away before Lauren could understand them. The rejection was a physical blow, colder than the wind. Each person who ignored them chipped away at her last fragments of hope. She fumbled inside her pocket, her fingers stiff and clumsy, searching for a spare mitten she thought she had. There was nothing. Her own hands were raw and red, the knuckles split. She tried to tuck Leo's tiny frozen fists deeper into the blanket, but his hands felt rigid like doll's hands. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her numbness. He wasn't just cold, he was dangerously cold. His whimpers were ceasing entirely, his small body becoming terrifyingly still against her chest. She bounced him gently, desperately trying to rouse him. "Leo baby, stay awake. Please, stay awake for mommy." A woman named Tiffany Scott, her arms laden with glossy shopping bags from a high-end boutique, stopped a few feet away. She frowned, her perfectly arched eyebrows knitting together. "Honestly," she muttered to her companion, loud enough for Lauren to hear, "some people have no shame, bringing a baby out in this weather. It's irresponsible." Her friend nodded in agreement, and they adjusted their cashmere scarves, stepping into the street to hail a taxi, their backs turned squarely on the mother and child. The words, meant to be dismissive, struck Lauren with the force of a slap. She wasn't irresponsible. She was desperate. She had nowhere else to go. The street lights flickered on, casting a sterile orange glow over the sidewalk. The light illuminated the frost forming on the edges of Leo's blanket and the single tear that had frozen on Lauren's own cheek. She could feel the deep, trembling shivers starting in her core, an uncontrollable quaking that made her teeth chatter violently. She squeezed her eyes shut, a prayer forming in her mind, a silent scream into the indifferent void. "Help us. Somebody, anybody, help us." The city's noise, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of a streetcar, the incessant hum of traffic, seemed to mock her silent plea. Her legs began to buckle. The last of her strength was draining away, siphoned off by the relentless cold. She sagged against the brick wall of the building behind her, its frozen surface leaching away what little heat she had left. She looked down at Leo's still face, his skin pale and waxy in the artificial light. A terrifying thought clawed its way into her mind. "He's giving up." The thought jolted her with a surge of adrenaline. She couldn't let him give up. She couldn't give up. She had to do something, anything. She tried to call out, to beg, but her throat was tight with unshed tears, and her jaw was locked from the cold. The sound that escaped was a choked, guttural sob, barely audible over the city's din. No one turned. No one noticed. It was as if she and her child were ghosts, already faded from the world of the living, visible only as an inconvenient obstacle on a busy sidewalk. Her vision started to swim, the edges blurring into a dark, swirling vortex. The faces of the passers-by became indistinct blurs of motion. She pressed her ear to Leo's chest, frantic, listening for the faint, thready beat of his heart. It was there, but it was slow, too slow. A fresh wave of terror washed over her, so potent it made her gasp. She had to keep him awake, keep him fighting. She began to sing a lullaby, her voice a cracked and wavering whisper, the words catching in her throat. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." The tune was lost in the wind, a fragile sound against the city's harsh symphony. The world seemed to be closing in, the sounds of the street growing distant and muffled as if she were underwater. Her own breathing was shallow, her body screaming for warmth and rest. Just as the last vestiges of her resolve began to crumble, a new sound cut through her haze. It was low and steady, a purr of refined power that grew progressively louder, distinct from the clatter of the other vehicles. Her infant's cry cut through the biting wind as the distant hum of an engine grew louder. The hum solidified into the sound of a luxury sedan, its engine barely a whisper as it glided to a stop directly at the curb in front of her. The car was a sleek, imposing block of polished black steel, its tinted windows reflecting the cold city lights like obsidian mirrors. For a moment, nothing happened. Passers-by continued their hurried march, their steps faltering slightly as they navigated around the expensive vehicle that had no business stopping in a no-parking zone. Lauren stared at it, her mind too clouded with cold to process what it meant. Was it a police car? Was she in trouble? Inside the car, a man in the back seat, Mr. Harrison, looked up from his tablet. He had been reviewing quarterly reports, his mind a world away, immersed in figures and projections. He was about to tell his driver to move on when a small detail caught his eye. It wasn't the woman huddled against the wall. At first, she was just part of the urban scenery. It was the unnatural stillness of the bundle in her arms. He had children of his own, grown now, but he remembered the constant, fidgeting energy of an infant. That utter lack of movement was wrong. "Hold on, Frank," he said, his voice calm but firm. The driver, a man who had worked for him for 15 years, glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes following his boss's gaze. He saw Lauren and Leo then, a small, desperate island in the stream of pedestrians. "My God," Frank whispered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Mr. Harrison didn't reply. He was no longer seeing a statistic or an inconvenience. He was seeing a mother and her child in profound distress. The sight cut through his corporate armor instantly. He watched as a couple, laughing and warm in their puffy jackets, sidestepped Lauren without a glance, their attention on a storefront window. He saw the faint, desperate movement of her lips as she whispered to the baby, her breath fogging in the air. The sheer brutal indifference of the scene struck him. It wasn't just the cold that was killing them, it was the apathy. Without another thought, he reached for the door handle. The decision was instantaneous, a command from a part of him that had nothing to do with profit margins or business strategy. The heavy car door opened with a solid, expensive thud, releasing a plume of warm air into the frigid evening. The sound was sharp and definitive, and it finally made a few people stop and turn. They saw the polished leather shoe, then the tailored trouser leg, then the imposing figure of a man in a dark wool suit emerging from the back of the sedan. His face was set with a look of intense concentration and concern. He paid no attention to the curious stares now directed his way. His focus was entirely on the shivering woman and her still child. Lauren flinched as the door opened, her weary eyes struggling to focus on the figure stepping out. He was tall, and the ambient light from the street cast his face in shadow, making him seem more like an apparition than a man. Fear, primal and instinctual, shot through her. Was he here to tell her to move along, to chastise her? Her grip on Leo tightened protectively, a final, futile maternal instinct. She braced herself for another harsh word, another dismissal that would shatter what was left of her spirit. Mr. Harrison walked around the front of the car, his movements swift and purposeful. The cold hit him, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled comfort of his vehicle, and he immediately understood the severity of their situation. The wind bit at his exposed face and hands, and he had been out in it for less than 30 seconds. She had been out here for who knows how long. He felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the world that allowed this to happen, at the dozens of people who had seen and done nothing. The few pedestrians who had initially paused were now forming a small, hesitant cluster on the sidewalk. Tiffany Scott, the woman with the shopping bags, had her taxi door open but had not yet gotten in. She was watching, her earlier judgment now mingling with a dawning sense of shame and curiosity. She saw the man from the car approaching the woman she had just condemned. The man's expression was one she recognized from charity galas and boardroom photos. It was one of power and authority, but right now it was filled with something else entirely, raw, unfiltered empathy. Lauren saw the man's shadow fall over her before she saw his face clearly. She looked up, squinting, and saw a man with graying temples and kind, worried eyes. He wasn't looking at her with disgust or annoyance. He was looking at her, at Leo, with an expression of profound concern. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence a sudden shield against the wind. He didn't speak. He just looked at Leo, his gaze taking in the baby's pale skin and the frost on his blanket. He knelt, the fabric of his expensive trousers pressing against the filthy, salt-stained concrete without a moment's hesitation. The action was so unexpected, so gentle, that it broke through Lauren's frozen shock. He was now at her level, meeting her gaze. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the howling wind. His eyes were fixed on the baby. The sound of his voice, calm and respectful, was the first kindness she had been shown all day. For the first time her infant's cry cut through the biting wind as the CEO's decisive footsteps approached from the frosty curb. Mr. Harrison did not wait for an answer. In one swift, decisive motion, he shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat. The sudden exposure to the biting wind made him flinch, but his focus never wavered. He leaned forward, carefully draping the coat over Lauren and her baby. The garment was immense, enveloping them both completely. It was still warm from his body heat, and smelled faintly of cedar and clean linen. For the first time in hours, a wave of profound, penetrating warmth began to seep through Lauren's frozen layers, a feeling so overwhelming it made her gasp. He wrapped the coat snugly around them, creating a warm, dark cocoon. "It's okay," he said softly, his hand resting gently on her shoulder for a second. "You're safe now." His touch was firm and reassuring. Lauren finally broke, a silent sob shaking her entire body as relief, powerful and dizzying, washed over her. Tears streamed down her face, melting the ice on her cheeks. She clutched the lapels of the coat, burying her face in the warm wool as she held Leo tightly inside its protective darkness. She felt a faint stir from the baby, a weak but present sign of life. Mr. Harrison stood and turned to his driver, who was already out of the car and waiting. "Frank, call the Grand Metropolitan. Tell them I'm sending 2 guests for the executive suite. Full service, charge it all to my personal account. Have them send a medic to the room to check on the child immediately, and get a car service ready to take them wherever they need to go tomorrow." He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. He wasn't asking, he was commanding resources into action, his years of executive authority now repurposed for a single critical mission. The small crowd of onlookers had grown. Tiffany Scott stood frozen by her open taxi door, the shopping bags hanging forgotten from her hands. She watched as the powerful man orchestrated a rescue with a few quiet words. The shame she felt was a hot, burning thing in her chest. Her earlier words about irresponsibility echoed in her ears, now sounding cruel and ignorant. She saw the shivering girl, not as a nuisance, but as a desperate human being her own careless judgment had dismissed. A man who had been rushing past earlier now stood silently, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face a mask of regret. Mr. Harrison turned his attention back to Lauren. "Ma'am, my name is Robert Harrison. My driver is going to take you and your son to a warm room. Can you stand?" Lauren, still swaddled in his coat, nodded numbly. The warmth was beginning to chase the deep chill from her bones, and she could feel her limbs again. With his help, she shakily got to her feet, her legs unsteady. She kept one arm wrapped securely around Leo, who was now stirring more noticeably within the coach shelter, and used the other to steady herself against the wall. As Frank opened the rear passenger door, creating an easy path, Tiffany Scott finally moved. She stepped forward hesitantly, her face flushed. Can I do anything?" she asked, her voice small. Mr. Harrison looked at her, his expression not angry, but weary. "You can," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made everyone listen. "The next time you see someone in need, don't step around them. Stop. Just stop." He didn't raise his voice, but the gentle rebuke silenced the entire sidewalk. Tiffany nodded, her eyes welling with tears as she looked from the CEO to Lauren. Mr. Harrison gently guided Lauren toward the open car door. "You and your son are my guests for as long as you need," he told her quietly. "We'll get you food, clothes, anything. Tomorrow we can talk about a more permanent solution. No more sidewalks, I promise you." As she slid into the plush, heated leather seat of the car, the warmth enveloped her like a physical embrace. She looked down at Leo, who was blinking slowly, his skin already regaining a hint of pink. He was safe. They were safe. The car door closed with a soft click, shutting out the cold and the stares of the crowd. As the sedan pulled away smoothly from the curb, Lauren looked back through the tinted window. She saw the small group of people still standing there, watching her go. They were no longer a faceless, indifferent mass. They were individuals, their faces etched with a mixture of shock, guilt, and a dawning understanding. Tiffany Scott stood clutching her bags, no longer looking triumphant from her shopping, but small and humbled on the cold street. The onlookers remained for a moment after the car disappeared, a silent, impromptu congregation of strangers bound by a shared moment of revelation. One by one, they began to disperse, but they moved differently now, their strides less hurried, their eyes no longer fixed straight ahead, but scanning the faces of those they passed. Tiffany Scott abandoned her taxi, walked to the nearest trash receptacle, and with a decisive thrust, shoved her expensive purchases inside. She walked away not toward home, but in the direction of a downtown mission, a new purpose in her step. Inside the warm, quiet car, Lauren Thompson held her son, Leo, who was now awake and looking up at her with clear eyes. She stroked his soft hair, her heart swelling with a gratitude so immense it left no room for any other emotion. The city lights blurred past the window, no longer cold and menacing, but sparkling like a promise. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the unmistakable, unshakable glimmer of hope for a new beginning, wrapped in the warmth of a stranger's coat.